$500 billion. That's not the cost of a war. That's the price tag on Europe's independence. Right now, beneath the Caspian Sea, drilling crews are working on what Moscow fears most, a pipeline that could permanently end Russia's stranglehold on European energy. The Trans-Caspian pipeline isn't just infrastructure, it's a geopolitical weapon. And Putin knows that once it's operational, Russia loses the leverage that has defined European politics for half a century. Welcome to States News, where we decode the military and geopolitical developments that shape our world. We cut through the headlines to show you what's really happening and why it matters. If you want to understand the strategic shifts that mainstream media misses, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe because what we're covering today changes everything about European energy security. The Trans-Caspian pipeline represents the most ambitious attempt yet to break Russia's energy monopoly over Europe. Stretching from Turkmenistan's massive gas fields across the Caspian Sea floor through Azerbaijan and Georgia and connecting to European networks via Turkey, this project would create a direct energy corridor that completely bypasses Russian territory. For decades, European nations have been held hostage by the threat of Moscow turning off the gas tap during winter. This pipeline would end that vulnerability forever. But the project faces massive obstacles: Russian diplomatic pressure, Caspian legal disputes, Azerbaijan-Iran tensions, massive engineering challenges in one of the world's most seismically active regions, and the question of whether European demand can justify the cost as the continent transitions to renewable energy. The stakes couldn't be higher. If completed, this pipeline restructures Eurasian geopolitics. If it fails, Russia's energy leverage continues for another generation. To understand why this pipeline matters, you need to understand Russia's energy weapon. Since the Soviet era, Moscow has used natural gas as its primary tool of influence over Europe. The statistics are staggering. Before the Ukraine invasion, Russia supplied 40% of European natural gas. Germany alone imported 55% of its gas from Russia. Italy relied on Russian gas for 43% of its supply. The infrastructure that enabled this dependence was built deliberately. Gazprom, Russia's state energy giant, spent decades constructing a web of pipelines that made Europe structurally dependent on Russian energy. The political leverage this created was enormous. When Ukraine sought closer ties with the European Union in 2014, Russia responded by cutting gas supplies not just to Ukraine, but to downstream European nations. Temperatures dropped. Heating bills soared. European leaders scrambled. Moscow made its point: cross us, freeze in the dark. This wasn't theoretical leverage. It was real, immediate, and it worked. European political leaders learned to calibrate their criticism of Moscow based on the calendar. You could criticize Putin in summer. Winter was a different story. The 2022 ITC Chakir Stature so Ambeshti IT-22 invasion of Ukraine shattered this arrangement, but didn't eliminate Europe's vulnerability. Russia cut gas supplies by 80% in retaliation for sanctions. European leaders scrambled to find alternative sources. Liquefied natural gas imports from the United States and Qatar surged. Conservation measures were implemented. Industrial production was curtailed. Europe survived the crisis, but barely. German industry, the engine of European manufacturing, faced energy costs 3 times higher than American competitors. Chemical plants shut down. Steel mills reduced capacity. The economic damage was real and lasting. Now consider Turkmenistan. This Central Asian nation sits on the world's 4th largest natural gas reserves. The Galkinish gas field alone contains an estimated 2 trillion cubic meters of gas. That's enough to supply all of Europe for more than 25 years at current consumption levels. But there's a problem. Turkmenistan's gas is landlocked. It can't reach European markets without crossing either Russian or Iranian territory. Russia has actively prevented Turkmenistan from developing alternative export routes. The Trans-Caspian pipeline solves this problem by going under the Caspian Sea. The route is complex, but workable. The pipeline would begin at Turkmenistan's Caspian coast, cross approximately 300 kilometers of seabed to Azerbaijan's shore, then connect to existing pipeline infrastructure, including the South Caucasus Pipeline and the Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, which already carry Azerbaijani gas to Turkey and Europe. The engineering is challenging. The Caspian Sea reaches depths of over 1,000 meters in some sections. The seabed is seismically active. Underwater mudslides are common, but the technology exists. Norway and Russia have successfully laid pipelines in even more challenging environments in the North Sea and Arctic Ocean. The legal framework is where things get complicated. The Caspian Sea's status has been disputed since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Is it a sea or a lake? That question isn't academic. If it's a sea, international maritime law applies, and countries can build infrastructure in their own sectors. If it's a lake, all five littoral states must agree on any major project. Russia and Iran argue for the lake interpretation precisely because it gives them veto power over pipelines. The 2018 Convention on the Legal Status of the Caspian Sea partially resolved this issue by allowing seabed projects without unanimous consent. But Russia continues to challenge any pipeline construction through diplomatic pressure and legal ambiguity. Let's start with what makes this pipeline strategically transformative. The Trans-Caspian pipeline doesn't just diversify Europe's energy sources. It fundamentally alters the balance of power in Eurasia. Right now, Turkmenistan exports most of its gas to China through the Central Asia-China pipeline system. China has leveraged this dependence to extract favorable pricing and political concessions. A Western export route would give Turkmenistan negotiating leverage against Beijing while simultaneously reducing European dependence on Moscow. This is why both Russia and China view the project as a strategic threat. From Europe's perspective, the appeal is obvious. Turkmenistan's gas reserves could replace Russian supplies entirely. The country has proven reserves of 13.6 trillion cubic meters and probable reserves that could be double that figure. The Galkinish field, developed with Chinese investment, produces 30 billion cubic meters annually and could expand to 100 billion cubic meters with additional investment. That's roughly equivalent to what Russia supplied to Europe before the Ukraine war. The pricing would be competitive. Turkmen gas at European terminals would cost approximately the same as liquefied natural gas imports from the United States or Qatar, but with more stable supply and lower carbon emissions than LNG shipping. But here's the first major complication. The pipeline's cost is staggering even by energy project standards. Initial estimates put the Trans-Caspian segment alone at $5 billion. Add in the necessary expansion of connecting pipelines through the Caucasus and Turkey, plus the upstream development required to increase Turkmenistan's production capacity, and you're looking at a total investment approaching $50 billion. That's not $500 billion. That figure represents the estimated value of energy security this infrastructure would provide Europe over its operational lifetime. Who pays for construction? European governments are reluctant to fund foreign infrastructure directly. Private energy companies won't invest without guaranteed returns. Turkmenistan lacks the capital for such a project. Azerbaijan could participate but can't carry the cost alone. This brings us to the geopolitical leverage game Russia is playing. Moscow doesn't need to physically block the pipeline. It just needs to make the project too risky and expensive to be commercially viable. Russian diplomacy has been working overtime to achieve exactly that. Moscow maintains that any Trans-Caspian pipeline violates the Caspian Sea's legal status. Russian officials have suggested that military exercises in the Caspian could become more frequent if pipeline construction begins. Gazprom has offered Turkmenistan alternative deals, increased purchases at premium prices if Ashgabat abandons the Trans-Caspian project. These aren't empty threats. Russia has demonstrated willingness to use military force in Georgia and Ukraine to prevent Western energy infrastructure from bypassing its territory. Let's talk about Iran's role, because Tehran's position is more complex than it appears. Iran officially opposes the Trans-Caspian pipeline, siding with Russia on the legal question. But Iran's opposition is based on different strategic calculations. Tehran views the Caspian seabed as environmentally sensitive and worries that increased energy development could harm fishing stocks. More importantly, Iran has its own plans for Turkmen gas. Tehran wants Turkmenistan to export gas southward through Iranian territory to lucrative markets in Pakistan and India. A Trans-Caspian pipeline sending Turkmen gas west undermines Iranian aspirations to become a regional energy hub. Iranian diplomats have quietly suggested that if the pipeline proceeds, Tehran might respond by supporting separatist movements in Azerbaijan or increasing military pressure in the South Caucasus. Now let's examine Azerbaijan's critical position in this equation. Baku is the linchpin of the entire project. Without Azerbaijani cooperation, the Trans-Caspian pipeline cannot work. Azerbaijan has significant incentive to see the project succeed. The country's own gas production from the Shah Deniz field is reaching plateau. Adding Turkmen gas to existing pipeline infrastructure would ensure full capacity utilization and generate substantial transit fees. But Azerbaijan faces its own constraints. The country's 2020 war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh created ongoing security challenges. Russian peacekeepers remain in the region. Moscow has leverage over Baku through its security role and its influence with Armenia. If Azerbaijan pushes too hard on the Trans-Caspian pipeline, Russia could destabilize Azerbaijan's northern borders or empower Armenian revanchism. Turkey's role deserves specific attention. Ankara has positioned itself as Europe's energy gateway, and it benefits enormously from pipelines crossing its territory. Turkish state pipeline company BOTAŞ already manages several major energy corridors. The Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, which opened in 2018, demonstrated Turkey's capability to handle large-scale transit projects. Turkish President Erdogan has publicly supported the Trans-Caspian Pipeline, viewing it as leverage in Turkey's complex relationship with both Russia and Europe. But Turkey's support comes with expectations. Ankara wants greater European investment in Turkish energy infrastructure and more favorable terms in Turkey's ongoing EU accession negotiations. European leaders have been reluctant to grant these concessions, creating friction that could slow the project. Here's where the engineering challenges become genuinely daunting. The Caspian Sea is not a forgiving environment. Laying pipeline in waters up to 1,000 meters deep requires specialized vessels that cost $500,000 per day to operate. The seabed consists of soft sediments that require careful geotechnical analysis to prevent pipe buckling. Seismic activity is significant. The region experiences earthquakes up to magnitude 6.0. Any pipeline must be designed to withstand ground movements of up to 2 meters. Underwater mudslides triggered by seismic events have been documented in the area. These could bury or rupture a pipeline if not properly protected. The environmental concerns are legitimate and substantial. The Caspian Sea is a unique ecosystem home to 90% of the world's sturgeon population. These fish are critically endangered, and their spawning grounds lie along the Turkmen and Azerbaijani coasts. Pipeline construction would disturb seabed sediments, potentially affecting water quality. Any leak would be catastrophic. Natural gas contains hydrogen sulfide in this region, making it toxic to marine life. Environmental groups have opposed the project on these grounds. While modern pipeline engineering includes multiple redundancy layers and leak detection systems, the risk cannot be eliminated entirely. Let's address the elephant in the room: Europe's energy transition. The European Union has committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Natural gas, while cleaner than coal, is still a fossil fuel. Does it make sense to invest $50 billion in fossil fuel infrastructure when the long-term goal is decarbonization? Proponents argue that natural gas serves as a transition fuel. It enables the retirement of coal plants while renewable energy capacity scales up. Gas turbines can quickly ramp up and down, providing grid stability that wind and solar cannot yet match. Critics counter that locking in gas infrastructure creates path dependence. Once built, pipelines operate for 40 to 50 years. The Trans-Caspian Pipeline wouldn't reach full capacity until the 2030s, just as Europe needs to be rapidly reducing fossil fuel consumption. The financing structure reveals another layer of complexity. No single entity will fund this project. It requires a consortium of European energy companies, international financial institutions, and potentially sovereign wealth funds. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has expressed interest, but won't commit without political risk guarantees. Commercial banks view the project as too risky given Russian opposition and Caspian legal ambiguities. This means European governments must provide political risk insurance, effectively guaranteeing that if Russia disrupts the project through military or diplomatic means, taxpayers will cover the losses. That's a hard sell politically, especially in countries like Germany, where significant business lobbies favor maintaining economic ties with Russia even after the Ukraine invasion. China's position in this equation is fascinating and often overlooked. Beijing has invested heavily in Turkmenistan's gas sector and takes 30 billion cubic meters of Turkmen gas annually through existing pipelines. China views Turkmenistan as a critical energy supplier but doesn't want exclusive dependence. A Trans-Caspian pipeline that gives Turkmenistan alternative export routes could actually benefit China by making Turkmen gas more affordable. If Ashgabat can sell to Europe, it has less leverage over Beijing in price negotiations. However, China also values its strategic partnership with Russia. Beijing will not actively support a project that Moscow opposes. Instead, China is likely to remain neutral, neither blocking nor facilitating the Trans-Caspian pipeline. Let's examine what happens if this pipeline gets built. The immediate geopolitical impact would be significant. Russia loses its primary leverage tool over European decision-making. Moscow can no longer threaten winter cutoffs to extract political concessions. This fundamentally changes the calculus in European capitals. Countries like Germany and Italy would feel more confident supporting Ukraine or imposing sanctions on Russia without fearing energy retaliation. Eastern European nations, which have been most vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail, would see their security environment transformed. Poland and the Baltic states have been pushing for alternatives to Russian gas for decades. The Trans-Caspian pipeline validates their strategic concerns and rewards their advocacy. For Turkmenistan, the pipeline represents economic liberation. Currently, the country is squeezed between Russian and Chinese leverage. Moscow controls northbound routes. Beijing dominates eastbound flows. Ashgabat has almost no negotiating power. A western route changes everything. Turkmenistan could play European, Chinese, and Russian buyers against each other. This would generate substantially higher revenues for the Turkmen government and potentially fund economic diversification beyond the energy sector. It might even create political pressure for reform in one of the world's most closed authoritarian systems. The Azerbaijan calculation is particularly interesting. Baku would become indispensable to European energy security. This isn't just about transit fees. It's about political leverage. Azerbaijan's human rights record has been a persistent obstacle in relations with Europe. European Parliament members regularly criticize Baku for suppressing dissent and limiting press freedom. But energy dependency creates strategic flexibility. Countries that control critical infrastructure get diplomatic cover. Look at how European criticism of Saudi Arabia or Qatar muted when LNG imports became essential. Azerbaijan would gain similar insulation. This troubles human rights advocates but reflects geopolitical reality. Now let's talk about the military implications that often get overlooked in energy discussions. Pipeline routes become strategic assets that require protection. The Trans-Caspian pipeline would create new vulnerabilities and new security requirements. The underwater section is relatively safe from sabotage, but the onshore segments through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey would need security infrastructure. Georgia remains partially occupied by Russia. Russian military forces in South Ossetia and Abkhazia could threaten pipeline infrastructure. Turkey faces its own security challenges with Kurdish separatist movements. Each country along the route would need to dedicate military and intelligence resources to pipeline protection. This creates opportunities for deeper security cooperation between Europe and the transit states. NATO could extend security guarantees to pipeline infrastructure, effectively expanding the alliance's area of concern. This would be controversial. Turkey is already a NATO member, but extending explicit protection to energy infrastructure in the South Caucasus would bring NATO closer to Russia's borders. Moscow would view this as escalatory, but from a European perspective, it might be necessary. You can't invest $50 billion in critical infrastructure and hope it remains safe. Security guarantees would have to be part of the package. The timeline matters enormously. If the political decision to proceed happens in 2026, construction couldn't begin until 2028 at the earliest. You need to complete environmental impact assessments, finalize engineering designs, secure all permits, and establish financing. The Trans-Caspian underwater section would take 3 to 4 years to complete. Connecting infrastructure upgrades would proceed in parallel. Optimistically, first gas could flow by 2033. That's 7 years from now. A lot can change in 7 years. European energy demand could shift dramatically. Political leadership in key countries will turn over multiple times. Russia's geopolitical position could strengthen or collapse. These uncertainties make long-term investment decisions incredibly difficult. But we need to acknowledge the legitimate uncertainties that cloud this project's future. First, the demand question is real. European natural gas consumption has been declining. The 2022 energy crisis accelerated this trend. High prices drove conservation. Industrial users permanently shifted operations to lower-cost regions. Residential users installed heat pumps and improved insulation. European gas demand in 2024 is 20% below 2021 levels. If this trend continues, will there be sufficient demand to justify a massive new supply pipeline? The project's economics depend on long-term supply contracts. European energy companies are hesitant to commit to 20-year gas purchase agreements when their own governments are pushing rapid decarbonization. Second, alternative supply routes are developing that could make the Trans-Caspian pipeline redundant before it's even completed. Liquefied natural gas import capacity in Europe is expanding rapidly. Germany is building 5 new LNG terminals. Spain and Italy are upgrading their receiving facilities. These terminals can accept gas from any supplier globally, providing more flexibility than a fixed pipeline from Turkmenistan. American LNG exports to Europe have tripled since 2021. Qatar is expanding production capacity with a specific focus on European markets. If LNG infrastructure scales sufficiently, the business case for the Trans-Caspian pipeline weakens. Third, we cannot dismiss the possibility that Russia succeeds in blocking the project through means short of military force. Moscow has sophisticated tools of diplomatic and economic pressure. Russia could offer Turkmenistan such favorable terms for northbound gas exports that Ashgabat decides the Trans-Caspian risk isn't worth taking. Russia could create legal challenges that tie the project up in international arbitration for years. Russia could fund opposition movements in Azerbaijan or Georgia that create political instability along the pipeline route. These hybrid warfare tactics have proven effective in the past. There's also the question of whether Turkmenistan's government is a reliable partner. The country is an authoritarian state with limited transparency. Contracts signed by the current leadership might not be honored by future governments. Turkmenistan has a history of unilaterally revising terms of energy agreements when circumstances change. International energy companies remember the 2009 pipeline explosion that cut gas deliveries to Russia, an incident that some analysts believe was deliberately orchestrated by Ashgabat to renegotiate pricing. Building critical European energy infrastructure dependent on Turkmen reliability is a risk that cannot be ignored. So where does this leave us? The Trans-Caspian pipeline is more than an energy project. It's a test of whether Europe can achieve genuine strategic autonomy in the 21st century. The technical challenges are solvable. The engineering exists. The gas reserves are proven. What's uncertain is whether European political leaders have the will to invest in long-term energy security when the short-term costs are high and the political headwinds are strong. If the pipeline is built, it represents a fundamental shift in Eurasian geopolitics. Russia's primary tool of coercion over Europe disappears. Turkmenistan gains strategic options it has never possessed. Azerbaijan becomes even more critical to European security. Turkey solidifies its position as an energy transit hub. China loses pricing leverage over Turkmen gas. The ripple effects extend far beyond energy markets into military alliances, diplomatic alignments, and economic integration patterns. If the pipeline fails, the implications are equally significant. Russia's energy leverage continues. Europe remains structurally vulnerable to Moscow's threats. Alternative suppliers gain even more influence over European energy security. The transition to renewable energy accelerates by necessity rather than choice. European unity faces ongoing tests every winter when heating bills arrive. The next 18 months are critical. Feasibility studies are underway. Diplomatic negotiations continue in Baku, Ashgabat, and Brussels. Engineering firms are preparing detailed designs. Financial institutions are assessing risk models. The decisions made in boardrooms and ministries over the next year will shape European energy security for the next half-century. This is the kind of strategic development that doesn't make headlines until it's too late to change the outcome. By the time the first gas flows through a completed Trans-Caspian pipeline, the geopolitical consequences will already be locked in. The same is true if the project collapses. The time to understand these stakes is now, while the decisions are still being made. We'll be tracking this story as it develops because energy infrastructure is destiny in geopolitics. The countries that control energy flows control political outcomes. The Trans-Caspian pipeline is about who controls Europe's destiny in the decades ahead. That's why this matters. That's why you need to understand it. And that's why you should subscribe to States News, because we'll keep you ahead of the curve on the strategic shifts that shape our world.